Reid Calloway walked into that estate sale with $4,000 in a manila envelope and walked out with a violin case that 3 different people had already kicked aside that morning. And what happened in the 22 days after that would cost the man who sold it to him everything he had spent a decade building. Stuart Vance had been running Vance Premier Auctions on King Street East in Hamilton for 11 years. He had developed a particular skill for reading a room, specifically for reading which people in a room were worth his time and which were not. When Reid walked through the door that Saturday morning in his steel-toed boots and the canvas jacket with the frayed left cuff, Stuart read him in approximately 4 seconds and filed him under not worth it. Reid had arrived looking for something small and mechanical, something he could restore with his hands, the way he restored most things, carefully and without rushing, in the rented workshop on Barton Street, where he spent his evenings after his daughter went to bed. Reid Calloway was 41 years old and had spent most of those years working with his hands in ways that left evidence. He had been a master instrument repair technician for 14 years, first at a shop in Burlington, and then on his own after his wife, Claire, died of a pulmonary embolism on a Tuesday morning 3 years earlier, leaving behind a mortgage he couldn't quite manage, a medical debt he couldn't quite ignore, and a 7-year-old girl named Addie, who had responded to the loss by becoming, as far as Reid could tell, more herself than she had ever been before. She drew horses in her notebooks. She asked questions at dinner that Reid sometimes needed a full day to answer properly. She had Claire's way of tilting her head when she was thinking, and Reid had learned in the months after the funeral to receive that gesture with gratitude rather than grief, which was harder some mornings than others. The workshop on Barton Street was his. He had set it up the first winter after Claire, partly for the income and partly because he needed somewhere to put the kind of focused attention that grief leaves restless and nowhere to go. He repaired stringed instruments mostly, violins, cellos, the occasional double bass that arrived in pieces from the back of someone's car. He had a reputation for patience and for a particular quality of listening that his clients described as unusual. He could hear what was wrong with an instrument before he opened the case. It was not a gift he had asked for. It was the result of 20 years of paying attention to the sounds things made when they were not quite right. The estate sale was a Saturday job, one of several he visited each season, looking for instruments that hadn't been properly identified. It happened more often than people expected. A family clears out a house quickly after a death. The administrator moves fast because they charge by the day, and a violin that a collector spent 40 years acquiring ends up on a folding table between a box of Reader's Digest condensed books and a set of fondue forks. Reid had found 3 instruments worth restoring that way in the past 2 years. Nothing remarkable, but nothing that had cost him more than he could afford to lose. Stuart Vance had set up the sale in a large Victorian on Herkimer Street, the estate of a man named Jeffrey Rains who had died at 87 without close family, a retired musicologist who had taught at McMaster for 30 years and then lived quietly and acquisitively for the 20 years after. The house was full. Stuart had moved through it the previous afternoon with his clipboard and his practiced assessments, and had priced everything he recognized and grouped everything he didn't into a miscellaneous lot in the back room, which was where Reid found himself half an hour after arriving. The violin case was on the floor against the baseboard. It was old, possibly older than the house. Black, covered in road dust that had been there long enough to become part of the surface, with 2 brass clasps that had oxidized to the color of old pennies. Someone had put a sticker on it that said $40. Reid crouched down and looked at it without touching it for a moment. He was aware of Stuart, watching him from the doorway with the particular expression of a man who is about to say something dismissive and is deciding how much effort to put into it. He opened the clasps. The case interior was lined with faded green velvet that had compressed and shifted with age. The instrument inside was dark with old rosin and surface oxidation, the varnish gone opaque in places, the chin rest missing, one string broken and curled back on itself. The bow was in the lower compartment with most of its horsehair intact. Reid lifted the instrument out of the case with both hands and turned it slowly in the available light. Stewart crossed his arms and said that the old professor had picked up a lot of junk over the years and that Reid shouldn't let the case fool him. He said, old didn't mean valuable. He said the $40 was already a generous price for something that wasn't going to play. Reid did not say anything. He was looking at the scroll. It was carved in a way that he had seen only in photographs. Not wrong, not unusual in a way that suggested an amateur, but unusual in a way that suggested a maker who had arrived at a particular solution through a different path than the standard one. The peg box was wider than production instruments of the period. The fluting along the scroll's final turn was shallower. These were not flaws. They were decisions. He turned the instrument and looked through the F-hole at the interior label. The light was bad, and the label had aged badly, but he could make out enough. A name. A city. A year that began with 17. He set the violin carefully back in the case and closed the clasps and looked up at Stewart. Stewart was already talking about the next item. Something about a credenza in the front room. Already half turned away, the conversation concluded in his mind before Reid had spoken a single word. Reid took out the envelope and counted out $40. Stewart looked at the money with the smile of a man who has just done what he considers a kindness to someone who doesn't know better. He took the bills without counting them and wrote Reid a receipt on a slip of paper and went back to the front of the house. Reid carried the case to his truck. He drove the 40 minutes home to the house in Dundas. With Addie in the passenger seat, she had been waiting in the truck with her library book and did not look up until they turned onto their street. And she glanced at the case in the back seat with the particular alertness of a child who has learned that what her father brings home in cases is usually interesting. She asked what was in it. He told her he wasn't sure yet. She thought about that for a moment and said that not being sure yet was usually more interesting than being sure. He agreed that it usually was. The workshop that evening was quiet in the way it got after 9. When the neighborhood settled and the furnace had found its rhythm. Addie had gone to bed after asking him 3 questions about why violins had F-holes instead of round holes, which he answered as accurately as he could, and she had seemed satisfied, or at least had run out of follow-up questions, which with Addie was roughly the same thing. He worked at the bench under the bright fluorescent light, with the instrument on a velvet pad and a magnifying lens on a swing arm. And what he found in the first 2 hours rewired everything he thought he knew about what he was looking at. The top plate was spruce, fine-grained in the way that the best makers selected it, but the graduation across the upper bout was not standard. It was thicker by a measurement he had to take 3 times before he trusted it, and the pattern of that graduation had a logic to it that he recognized from only one source. A monograph he had read 6 years earlier about the workshop practices of a specific atelier in Cremona in the early 18th century, a small shop, productive for only about 15 years, whose instruments had not entered the commercial record in significant numbers because the maker had died young and left no apprentices, and the workshop had closed, and most of what they'd built had dispersed into private hands without documentation. He looked again at the interior label through the F-hole with a dental mirror and a focusable pen light. The name was clearer now. The first letter was an A. The city was Cremona. The year was 1709. He sat back from the bench and looked at the ceiling for a while. Then he went to the kitchen and made coffee and came back and looked at the instrument again, as though a few minutes might have changed what he'd seen. It had not. He called his friend Patrick soon the following morning. Patrick had been his closest friend since their apprenticeship at the Burlington shop, a meticulous and slightly obsessive man who now worked as a provenance researcher for a Toronto insurance firm that specialized in fine art and musical instruments, tracking ownership histories, identifying fraudulent attributions, verifying claims. He was the person Reid trusted most with information that needed to be handled carefully. Reid described what he'd found without overstating it. The graduation pattern, the scroll, the label, the year. He did not use the word he was thinking. Patrick was quiet for a moment that was slightly longer than his usual pauses. Then he said he would need photographs, everything Reid could shoot, interior, exterior, scroll, label, top plate, back, ribs, the neck root, the base bar if Reid could get a clean shot through the F-hole. Reid sent 41 photographs within the hour. Patrick called back at 11 that night. His voice had the particular quality it got when he was being professionally careful about something he personally found remarkable. He said the label was consistent with the period and the location. He said the graduation pattern Reid had described and photographed matched what was documented in the monograph and in 2 subsequent academic papers he was aware of. He said the scroll carving was identifiable. He used that word carefully, as consistent with an instrument he had seen referenced in a catalog raisonné from a German auction house, a catalog that listed 3 known surviving instruments from that workshop, all of which were currently in institutional collections in Europe. He said if Reid was holding what he appeared to be holding, it was not the 4th known instrument from that workshop. It was the first one that had ever been in private hands outside Europe. He said Reid needed to stop handling it and needed to talk to someone who had spent their career on exactly this kind of instrument, and he said he knew who that was. Meanwhile, the situation at Vance Premier Auctions had begun to move in a direction Stuart Vance had not anticipated. A former assistant of his, a woman named Teresa, who had left the company 2 years earlier after a disagreement about wages that Stuart had resolved by not resolving it, had been following the estate sale listings and had seen the Herkimer Street listing go up and had recognized the name Jeffrey Rains from a conversation she had overheard in Stuart's office the previous year. Stuart had been on the phone with a dealer in Montreal. He had mentioned the Rains estate. He had mentioned that Rains had acquired several significant instruments through private channels in Europe in the 1970s and 80s. He had said that when the estate came available, it would be worth being first in the room. Teresa called Reid through a mutual contact on the Tuesday after the sale. She told him what she had heard. She said Stuart had known about the estate for at least a year and had arranged to handle the sale himself, specifically to have access to the inventory. She said, whatever Stuart had said about the violin being junk, he had known the estate contained instruments that might be significant. He had simply assumed that nobody at a $40 price point would know the difference. His assumption had been wrong. Reid was under the rear bout with a work light on a Thursday evening, checking the interior corner blocks when he found the marking. It was not a label and not a number. It was a small symbol stamped into the wood of the end block, barely 3 millimeters across, a shape that Reid recognized from the monograph, a specific mark that the maker had used to identify instruments intended for private commission rather than open sale. It meant the instrument had been built to order for a specific recipient. He photographed it 3 times from different angles and called Patrick. Patrick said he needed to sit down. Then he said that the commission mark, if authentic, would be the first physical confirmation that the workshop had accepted private commissions, in addition to its documented output, which was something that scholars had theorized but never been able to prove. He said the instrument was not just valuable as a playing instrument, it was potentially significant as a historical document. He said Reid needed to talk to Dr. Nora Fenn. Nora Fenn had spent 26 years as a specialist in early Italian stringed instruments at a conservation institute in Ottawa, had authenticated instruments for auction houses in London, Vienna, and New York, and had written the definitive English-language study of the Cremonese workshops of the early 18th century, a study that was on the shelf of every serious researcher in the field. She was known for a professional skepticism that she applied without exception to unsolicited claims about significant instruments. because she had learned through decades of experience that the distance between hope and evidence was almost always longer than people wanted to believe. Reid called her on a Friday morning. He gave his name and his background, described the instrument factually, and read her the maker's name from the label without embellishment or conclusion. She asked him to repeat the year on the label. He repeated it. She said she would need photographs before she could say anything. He said they were already sent. She said she would look that afternoon. She called Saturday morning. Her voice was the same as it had been on the phone, measured, professionally careful, but underneath the carefulness was a quality that Reid recognized as focus, that had become personal rather than general. The sound of someone who has been waiting a long time for a specific thing and is being very controlled about the possibility that it has arrived. She said the photographs were consistent with everything she would expect to find in an instrument from that workshop in that period. She said the graduation pattern was. She chose the word deliberately, distinctive, in a way that matched her own documented observations of the two instruments from that workshop she had examined in person. She said the commission mark, if it was what it appeared to be, was something she needed to see in person before she would commit to any conclusion. She said she could drive to Hamilton that Sunday. She arrived in a dark blue Subaru at 9 in the morning with a leather instrument case of her own and a soft-sided bag of equipment and the organized calm of someone who has been disappointed by remarkable claims before and has learned to keep that experience visible. She spent 3 hours with the instrument at Reid's bench, working in silence with her own tools, her own lights, her own measurements. Reid made coffee and stayed near without intruding. Addie came to the doorway once, assessed the situation with the accuracy children have for knowing when something important is happening, and went back to her room without being asked. When Nora finally stood up from the bench and faced Reid, she took a moment before speaking, and in that moment he saw something shift in the controlled surface of her expression, not collapse, but yield slightly, the way a held breath releases without sound. She told him what she had found. The varnish composition, she said, was consistent with the specific amber-red ground layer documented in only one other instrument she had examined personally. The neck root joint was finished with a technique she had written about in her 2009 paper, a technique so specific to this workshop that its presence was, she said, functionally identifying. The commission mark was not only authentic, but corresponded to a mark she had found, referenced in a single surviving letter from the workshop. A letter held in a private archive in Brescia that she had spent 4 years tracking down. She said the instrument was real. She said that under proper auction conditions, with full provenance documentation and independent authentication from at least one additional European specialist, she believed the sale value would exceed $1 million significantly. She paused. She said she needed him to understand what significantly meant in this context. She said it could reach $6 million, possibly more, depending on the room. Reid sat down on the stool at his bench. He had been standing for 3 hours and had not noticed until that moment. The news moved through Hamilton in the way news moves through a city that is smaller than it looks. Reid had not spoken to anyone outside Patrick and Nora, but Nora had made inquiries with 2 European colleagues about additional authentication specialists, and one of those colleagues had connections in the Montreal dealer network, and within 10 days the outline of the story had reached Stuart Vance. Stuart arrived at the workshop on a Wednesday afternoon without calling. He parked the white Audi on the street and walked in with the ease of a man who assumes all spaces are open to him by default. He was wearing the charcoal blazer he wore to client meetings, and the expression of a man who has prepared several approaches and is deciding which one will work fastest. He looked at the violin in its case on the bench. Then he looked at Reid. He said there had been an administrative error in the sale documentation for the Herkimer Street estate. He said the violin had not been properly catalogued, and that its inclusion in the general sale had been a processing oversight. He said the estate's administration was prepared to reverse the transaction in full, return Reid's $40, and resolve the matter cleanly. Reid said he wasn't interested in reversing the transaction. Stewart's expression adjusted. He explained, in the tone of someone doing a favor, that instruments of uncertain provenance were subject to specific legal considerations. That a private individual holding an instrument whose ownership chain could not be fully documented might find themselves navigating heritage law in ways that were expensive and time-consuming, and that he, Reid, was probably not equipped to manage. He let that sit in the air for a moment. Addie was at her table in the corner of the workshop. She was doing her homework. She did not look up from the page, but she had stopped moving her pencil. After Stewart left, Reid called Patrick. Patrick drove from Toronto that evening with a folder that had taken him 4 days to assemble. He sat at the kitchen table and went through the estate sale documentation line by line. What he found was that Stewart Vance, in his certainty that the $40 transaction was valueless and therefore beneath scrutiny, had executed the bill of sale with a completeness that now served Reid entirely. The document transferred full title to all items purchased at the sale, itemized by purchase price and described by physical characteristics, with Stewart's own signature and the estate administrator's countersignature. There was no caveat, no reservation of rights, no exclusion clause. Stewart had wanted the transaction to be final from his side. It was final from Reid's instead. His own carefulness had built his own trap. 4 nights after Stewart's visit, Reid woke at 2:30 to the sound of something at the workshop's rear window. He was across the dark house in under a minute and found the window frame had been forced, not broken, worked with something thin and flat, and the interior of the workshop had been searched with a methodical quality that felt professional. The shelf above the bench had been cleared. The filing cabinet had been opened. Nothing was missing. The instrument had not been touched. The security camera Reid had installed above the workshop door had recorded the street from 11 o'clock onward. In the footage, a figure in a dark jacket and watch cap moved along the side of the building at 12:47 and again at 2:18. The second pass was in better light, clear enough to see the jacket. The right chest pocket had an embroidered logo. It was the logo of Vance Premier Auctions. Reid uploaded the footage to 3 separate locations before dawn, sent copies to Patrick and to Nora, and then sat at his kitchen table with his coffee in the particular quiet of a man who has made a decision that has been forming for some time and has now finished forming. He was not going to be moved. Nora coordinated the authentication process with the efficiency of someone who had navigated institutional timelines for 26 years. A specialist from Vienna, Dr. Ernst Keller, who had spent his career examining early Italian instruments and had personally examined one of the 3 known instruments from the same workshop in the Kunsthistorisches Museum collection, agreed to fly to Canada for a 2-day examination. A second specialist, based in Montreal, a luthier scholar named Isabelle Cote, who had written on commission practices in the Cremonese workshops of the same period, completed an independent remote assessment from Reid's photographs and measurements before the in-person examination. Both specialists reached the same conclusion. The instrument was authentic. The commission mark was genuine. The ownership chain from Reid's purchase was unambiguous and legally documented. The auction house that Nora had been quietly speaking with, based in Toronto with international bidder access, confirmed they would proceed. Stewart Vance learned about the auction the way people learn about things they've been excluded from, too late and from the wrong source. He arrived at the gallery space in the Distillery District on the morning of the sale with a business connections credential and enough confidence to get past the front check. He made his move during the preview period, approaching 2 of the auction house's administrative staff and stating, with enough volume to be overheard, that the instrument's provenance was disputed and that the sale was proceeding on the basis of a fraudulent transaction. Several people turned. Nora was already moving. She presented the auction house's legal representative with a folder that had been prepared 3 days earlier specifically for this moment. The original bill of sale with Stewart's signature. The provenance documentation. The trail camera footage from the workshop. Patrick's sworn statement about Stewart's prior knowledge of the Rains Estates musical holdings. A letter from Reid's lawyer noting that any further interference with a lawful sale would constitute tortious interference and be met with immediate legal action. The legal representative read the folder in 9 minutes. Then she walked across the room to Stewart Vance and told him, with the particular courtesy of someone trained in managing difficult situations without drama, that the documentation established clear and unencumbered ownership in the seller, that the sale would proceed as scheduled, and that any legal claims he wished to pursue were welcome through appropriate channels after the conclusion of the event. She said his continued presence was conditional on his conduct, and that further disruption would result in his credentials being revoked. Stewart sat down. He sat in the third row and said nothing for the next 2 hours. Whatever he had expected to happen, the thing he had calculated would happen when he applied enough pressure to a man in Reid's position had not happened. The documentation had held. The preparation had held. Reid sat in the front row with Addie beside him and Nora on his other side, and he did not look at Stewart once. The bidding opened at $400,000. It moved faster than anyone in the room had expected. 700,000, 1.2 million, 2 million, 3.4. The 2 remaining bidders, one in the room and one on the telephone through a representative, traded the figure in careful increments, each one landing with a weight that silenced the room for a moment before the next came. At 5.8 million, the room bidder paused. The telephone representative made a final offer. The auctioneer raised the gavel, looked at the room bidder, waited exactly 4 seconds. The gavel came down at $6.1 million. The applause that followed was the kind that takes a moment to start and then runs longer than anyone planned. Reid held Addie's hand. She was looking at the violin on the display stand at the front of the room, the instrument clean and lit and entirely itself, and she had the expression she got sometimes when she encountered something she hadn't yet found the right words for. Not speechless, just still. He recognized it from Claire. He held her hand and did not say anything. In the third row, Stewart Vance was looking at the same instrument. What he felt was his own concern. What he was about to lose was about to become public record. The day after the auction, Stewart found Reid in the lobby of the hotel near the gallery before checkout and asked if they could speak. Reid agreed. They sat in 2 chairs near the window, and Stewart talked for a while about the pressures of running an estate sale business, about the way the market had changed, about the genuine uncertainty of identification at the time of sale. He did not apologize, but there was something in the way he spoke that Reid recognized, the quality of a man who has finally understood the dimensions of what he let go and is searching for a version of events in which he is less responsible for it. He suggested that some acknowledgement of his role in bringing Reid to the estate in the first place might be appropriate. He used the word partnership. He said it carefully. Reid let him finish. Then he said, without heat, that Stewart had sold him the violin for $40 because he was certain Reid was too unsophisticated and too unremarkable to understand what he was looking at. He said Stewart had threatened him, had sent someone to search his workshop, and had attempted to disrupt a lawful sale in front of a room full of witnesses and cameras. He said he did not owe Stewart Vance anything. He said it clearly, and he said it once. Then he stood, extended his hand with the habit of courtesy that had always been one of his fixed qualities, and walked to the elevator. The footage from the workshop security camera, combined with Patrick's documentation of Stewart's prior knowledge of the Rains estate, had been forwarded to the relevant authorities by the auction house's legal team before the sale concluded. Within 3 weeks, Vance Premier Auctions was under investigation, not only for the workshop intrusion, but for a pattern that became visible. Once investigators began looking, inflated buyers' premiums that had not been disclosed in sale agreements, estate documentation that had been altered on at least 2 occasions, and a probate administrator who told investigators he had signed paperwork he had not been given time to read. The dealer's license was suspended pending the investigation. The King Street office closed. The white Audi sat in the parking lot for 2 weeks before it was towed by arrangement of Stewart's creditors. Stewart retained legal counsel and entered a process his lawyer described as prolonged. Reid paid off the medical debt the week the funds cleared. $43,000 that had followed him like something he could hear, but not quite see, and then it was gone, and the silence where it had been was its own kind of sound. He paid 6 months of advanced rent on a larger workshop space on James Street North and filed a business registration with the city under the name Addie's Bench. He ordered a sign from a local sign painter, dark green background, cream lettering, the kind of sign that tells you exactly what kind of place it is, without needing to say more than the name. He bought a 12-year-old Subaru wagon with a clean inspection history and drove Addie to school in it. The first morning it was his. She said it smelled like someone else's coffee. He said that would go away. She thought about it and said she didn't actually mind it. 3 months after the auction, Nora arranged for Reid and Addie to visit the instrument at the home of its new owner, a retired conductor named Franklin Bird, who lived outside Ottawa and who had spent 30 years researching the Cremonese workshops of the early 18th century without ever believing he would own an instrument from the one workshop he considered most significant. Franklin received them in his study, which was lined with books and did not feel like a museum, and took them to the room where the violin was kept, a small climate-controlled space that felt more like a library than a display. The instrument was on a stand behind glass, lit from one side with a warm light that showed every detail of the varnish surface. The amber-red color that Reid had noticed under his bench light was extraordinary under the proper illumination, rich and layered in a way that made the surface look alive, like something that was still in the process of becoming. Addie stood in front of the glass for a long time without speaking. Then she looked at her father and asked, the way she asked everything, directly and without softening it, whether he was sad they didn't have it anymore. Reid considered the question seriously. He told her that the violin had never really been theirs in the way things you keep are yours. It had been theirs to find, to understand, to return to what it had always been. He said the money was real, and the workshop was real, and the debt being gone was real, but that none of those were the biggest thing. He said the biggest thing was simpler. He had walked into a room where someone had decided that a man in steel-toed boots with $40 in an envelope wasn't worth paying attention to. He had picked up what that person couldn't be bothered to look at, and he had shown, by the work of his own hands and the patience of his own eyes, that the judgment had been wrong. Not wrong about the violin, wrong about him. Addie thought about that for a while. Then she said she thought the violin had always known what it was, and had been waiting for someone who would actually listen. Reid looked at his daughter standing in the quiet room beside that old instrument. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said she was probably right. Nora came to the workshop on James Street North on a Thursday morning in early March, wearing a heavier coat than the last time he'd seen her and carrying a folder of papers. She had 3 clients who needed restoration work done on significant instruments. Not auction preparation, but genuine conservation, the kind that required someone who understood the mechanics of old instruments as working objects rather than as financial assets. She said Reid's combination of technical skill and trained listening was unusual enough that she wanted to formalize the arrangement. She would provide the clients. He would do the work. They would split the referral fee. Reid said he was interested, with one condition. Nora waited. He said whatever the arrangement required, nothing could begin before 8:50 on school mornings, because he drove Addie to school every day. and that was not a negotiable item. Nora looked at him for a moment and then smiled. The first time he had seen her smile without the professional reserve behind it, and said that worked fine. He drove Addie to school the next morning, along the familiar route through the West End, her backpack on her lap and her notebook open to something she was finishing, the Subaru still faintly smelling of someone else's coffee, though she had been right that it was fading. She closed the notebook as they pulled up to the curb. She said she would see him at 3:15. He said he would be there. He watched her walk through the doors, and then pulled back into the morning traffic and headed north toward the workshop on James Street, where 3 new instruments were waiting on the bench, and the sign above the door said, in cream letters on dark green, exactly what he needed it to say.